All right. So, UC Davis has a special program called the Hummingbird Health and Conservation Program. It's part of the UC Davis Veterinary School. And they were kind enough to work with me and share some of their slides. And I spent today working on editing them. So it's not perfect, but I think it'll be pretty good. So I hope you enjoy this. But yeah, a lot of the wonderful photos are from the folks at UC Davis and also collaborators. Yeah, and also like to thank Fish and Wildlife Service for giving me time to do this as well. But yeah, so this will be an introduction to hummingbird ecology, identification, and also conservation. And a special thanks to Lisa Tell, a veterinarian with UC Davis, and she runs the Hummingbird Health and Conservation Program. So why do we care about hummingbirds? Well, I would love to hear from all of you actually to see what brings you to this program and what your interests are related to hummingbirds. So if you don't mind, if you're comfortable shouting out, I would love to hear what your thoughts are and why you think hummingbirds are special.
Pollination.
Yeah.
I saw a program a little while ago that they said that the hummingbird is the only bird that can fly backwards.
Yes, that's a good one.
I never knew there were so many kinds until recently.
Yeah, there's a lot of diversity in hummingbirds.
Is that
anyone else?
Tongue sticking out on the lower right? Yeah.
All right, well, maybe we'll dive in. So I think hummingbirds are just these magical little creatures. I think that's just amazing they exist at all. They're just living on the hairy edge of what's possible, and it's just truly amazing. So yeah, I'm really excited to talk more about hummingbirds with y'all. But yeah, so one thing that's nice about hummingbirds is they can be seen pretty much anywhere in North America and South America. They are all over the place, and they're just these brightly colored jewels that flit across the landscape. And what's nice too is they can be seen in both urban and suburban environments as well as in the wilds. So they're available for everyone to enjoy. There are a number of species that are either listed as threatened or endangered, not within the US, but in other countries. But in the US, we do have a couple species listed as birds of conservation concern or special concern. Hummingbirds provide really important ecosystem services. Like someone mentioned, they are important pollinators for a lot of our flower species, and they've actually co-evolved with a number of plants, which is really amazing. So a number of plant species actually depend on hummingbirds to get pollinated. They're also a sentinel species for our overall environmental health, and they're culturally significant as well. In Native American culture, hummingbirds are known to be healers. They bring healing and help to others. And they also symbolize good luck to those who see the bird. And in some pueblos, hummingbirds also represent bringing of fire. However, even though these species are well loved, very little is known about their health and their phenology and what's needed for their long-term survival. So some of the basics. Here's a pop quiz. Does anyone know what that species is? That photo that's in the the middle there, the long bill. No worries if you don't know. Anyways, that's one of my favorites. It's a swordbill hummingbird. I just think it's so cool. It must have a really strong neck to be able to carry that thing around. But yeah, so they're in the order of Protoformes, which means that they have no feet or are unfooted. Other species that are in that group are also swifts, which if you've ever seen a swift up close, you'll notice that they're always airborne and they very rarely land, and they have teeny tiny feet because they hardly ever use them. Hummingbirds are in the family Trochilidae, which means small bird, and there's greater than 300 species in North and South America. They're restricted to the New World, so that includes the Caribbean, South, Central, and North America. And they're in a variety of habitats, including deserts, meadows, woodlands, forests, and they're found from sea level into foothills and up to the timberline. And they're even found on the highest levels of the Andes, which is pretty remarkable considering how little oxygen there is up there. So these are the smallest birds in the world. The smallest species include the Cuban bee hummingbird and the calliope hummingbird, which can be seen in North America. And the largest species of hummingbirds include the giant hummingbird and the blue-throated hummingbird, which blue-throated hummingbirds can also be seen in North America. So the best place to go there to see them is in Arizona, especially southern Arizona. Their metabolism is extremely high. They constantly need to refuel. When compared to other vertebrates, a hovering hummingbird has the fastest metabolism for its size. They live on the edge of what is energetically possible with their fast metabolism and small size. Hummingbirds have specialized circulatory and respiratory systems to efficiently deliver oxygen and nutrients to their flight muscles. And hummingbirds rapidly gain weight when they are preparing for migration. The weight they gain is mostly from fat, and fat is preferred because it contains double the energy that carbohydrates contain. And the hummingbird diets vary by habitat and season. A given species may feed primarily on flower nectar or primarily on arthropods, depending on what is available in a given habitat or season. Many hummingbirds also feed on tree sap when flowers aren't available by using holes created by other bird species. Hummingbirds can obtain sugar from flower nectar, which provides a quick source of energy. Hummingbirds obtain fat, protein, and salt from eating insects and spiders. And also wanted to mention that they rely on visual cues to identify their food. Red color especially really stands out to hummingbirds, though they will feed from other flower colors. But yeah, red especially is quite vibrant in many colors or many flower species that we have, and so it's easily seen. It's also a heat absorbing color, so it heats up the nectar, which hummingbirds prefer. And then that last bullet there talks about torpor, which raise your hand if you've ever heard of torpor and know what that is. I had never heard of it before, and I thought it was really interesting. Well, so torpor, so hummingbirds are one of the few groups of birds that can go into torpor. That's a very deep sleep-like state in which metabolic functions are slowed to a minimum and a very low body temperature is maintained. They also slow down their heart rate and their respiration rate as well during torpor. Hummingbirds have high metabolic demands and their feathers are poor insulators. So going into torpor allows them to survive when conditions make it impossible to maintain their normal 105 degrees Fahrenheit body temperature. This allows hummingbirds to use up to 50% less energy than when they are awake. And in the winter time, I don't know if you've noticed, sometimes hummingbirds can take a long time to get going in the morning. And this is usually because they're in torpor and they rely on the sun to get warm. most often. So it can take them a longer period of time to get going. They, as Uncle Bob mentioned, they have amazing flying abilities. They can go forward, backward, and they can also hover in place for extended periods, which some species of birds, they can hover, but usually not for the same extent that hummingbirds can. It's really amazing. For their migration, they are, some of them are long distance migrators. They can travel up to 600 miles going 25-mile-an-hour rate. And rufous hummingbirds can travel 3,000 miles in one direction, which is really insane for such a tiny little bird. And their wing beat, they can beat up to 80 beats per second, and that's during their fastest flight, though they can go down to slower wing beats rates during their normal flight, which isn't like super speedy. Let's see. I took some notes too, so I'm just skimming over them to make sure I didn't forget anything. Oh yeah, so I guess the average is 53 wing beats per second during a typical flight. And then yeah, the amethyst wood star, which is a South American species, they have the fastest rate, and they can reach up to 80 beats per second. And then their heart rate is as fast as 1,200 beats per minute and as slow as 50 to 180 beats per minute during cold nights. So it's really amazing thinking about how quickly, yeah, their body can process everything. Oh, and I learned this too, that, well, so in North America, they are very territorial, but and South American species aren't necessarily as territorial. And I'm not sure why that is. I didn't have a chance to actually do a lot of research into that and putting this presentation together, but I'd always thought that most North American species were territorial. And I didn't realize that they weren't as territorial in South America. But some species are more territorial than others. And I don't know if any of you have noticed that this at your feeders or your plants, where for example, like rufous hummingbirds, I know when they migrate through, they're especially feisty. And even though they're smaller than like Anna's hummingbird species, they will like fight off the Anna's hummingbirds to dominate a certain set of flowers or a particular feeder. They're really territorial. The Annas are usually like, I don't want to get into this, it's too much trouble for me. And also their lifespan can be very depending on the species. I was looking for Allen's hummingbirds. I was reading that they usually live about 4 to 5 years, whereas some species like broad-tailed hummingbirds, there's some records of 12-year-old birds. And I know with UC Davis, we've gotten some pretty old birds that we've recaptured. We had a couple that were about 10 years old, which is really amazing considering what they go through to survive. And they also, I thought this was interesting too. I know a number of species migrate in flocks, but hummingbirds like to have an individual migration, so they migrate alone. Hummingbirds also demonstrate strong site fidelity, which means that they often return to the same breeding grounds or the same wintering grounds each year. And so with the Hummingbird Health and Conservation Program at UC Davis, they've done many years of study of banding hummingbirds. And then in the last few years, they've been doing a study putting in RFID tags, or like little radio tags on hummingbirds, and to track their movements and really be able to tell like to the minute when they return to the same yard that they were captured in before. And it's just really incredible to see, like you can tell each year when a bird is returned from their wintering grounds and they've come back to the same yard to feed and to breed every year. for a number of years. It's just truly amazing that they have a really good memory. I thought this was interesting, though it might be a little confusing. There's a lot going on in this slide, but basically it's the life cycle of hummingbirds, and it shows it on the calendar year. So in the middle, there's a red line from January through December, and the upper half of the slide shows the life cycle for adults. And the lower half of the slide shows the life cycle for young birds. And so we'll start with adults on the top, but basically they start the year by migrating, and they arrive at their breeding grounds, and they go through courtship, and then they build their nest, and then hopefully, if everything goes well, they lay eggs. And then once they raise their young, everyone will start to disperse or migrate and move back to their wintering grounds. And then towards the end of the year, they go through a molt. I won't go into the molt details because molt can be really confusing. I don't totally understand it yet. I feel like I need to take some molt specific courses. But yeah, they basically replace all of their feathers towards the end of the year. And then they start it all over again in January. And depending on the species, the time of year can slide a little bit for these different activities. Like for Anna's hummingbirds, for example, they can actually start breeding and like egg laying in January. So I always keep that in mind when like for tree trimming, for example, like a lot of folks, well, hopefully most folks will try to trim their trees outside of the breeding season. But I always try and keep an eye out for any like hummingbird activity, because sometimes they'll already have a nest that's going, and you may not be aware of it when you call your tree trimmers. So yeah, I usually try in our yard, I try and do some monitoring to look for any hummingbirds like going back and forth to the same tree to know that I need to look for a nest before trimming those branches. And so on the bottom part of the slide, so the young birds, they're called hatch year birds, which is HY. And I should have mentioned that for the adult birds. So adult birds are called after hatch year, or AHY. Those are the codes we use for banding. But yeah, so they can hatch anywhere from late January through early summer. And so while they're in the nest, they actually go through their first molt, and they replace all of their natal down with juvenile plumage. And then once that's done, they're ready to fledge and leave the nest. And then from there, the young birds, they will usually hang out around the nest for a little bit, but they disperse pretty readily after that. And they'll start migrating down to their wintering grounds. And then once they're on their wintering grounds, they go through another molt, and they replace all their feathers. And this happens like in the fall period. And so it's early as the fall. I've seen some birds like Anna's, for example, like in August with adult plumage. And it can make it really hard to tell how old they are if they have their adult plumage in the same year that they hatched. They look like they're older than they actually are. So it can make aging really difficult. But yeah, there's some other tools that we can use to help determine what age they are. So I just pulled this from Birds of North America online. I don't know if any of you use Birds of North America online. And actually, I forgot, they changed their name recently from Birds of North America to Birds of the World online. So I need to correct that in this slide. But yeah, for each species, it's really cool. Actually, you can pay for an account, but they have just so much amazing scientific information about all species of birds. I use it quite a lot when making decisions for work. because it just has everything in there. It includes like all the people that have written papers and contact information for them as well. So whenever I've had questions, I can usually reach out to an author to just talk to them directly to get advice, which has been really, really great. But anyway, so I pulled this graphic from that website. And so this is just an example of the life cycle. And so it's just a different form from that previous slide. But yeah, the light blue in the center shows the molt, the times a year, and the thicker bar shows like the average, and the thinner bars that extend outward from either end show like when it still can happen, but it's less likely to happen during that time of year. Anyways, I just thought it was a really cool graphic to share. Different way of looking at the same problem. And then this I thought was helpful just for like knowing what species are present in California during different times of the year. So with annas, they're present year round. So annas are really cool because some of them are resident birds and they don't migrate, and others are migratory and will make long migrations. So I thought they're really neat because usually like one species, like everybody will migrate or everyone will be a resident, but they're a mix. And then black-chinned hummingbirds, they're a migratory species. So they're here from March through September usually. And then rufous are usually here just during migration time. So just in early spring and in the fall. And then costas can usually be found in Southern California, but they're not, you don't see them as often. They can show up in the winter time. And calliope, we also don't see them very often. They're usually in higher elevation areas. But I have gotten one in my yard on a hummingbird sage, which I was so excited. It actually like showed up right next to me when I was weeding my yard. It was super cool. But yeah, so they're usually only here in the winter time. And then they can be seen in the high elevation in the Sierras in the summertime. And then Allens, you'll see Allens more along the coast. And they're usually here in the late winter through midsummer. And then broadtails, they're more of a Southern California species as well. So like you can't see them down there in the summertime. So here are some beautiful photos of male hummingbirds that can be seen in California. They're pretty amazing. They're just so brightly colored. They're all pretty unique looking, except for rufous and Allen's hummingbirds. They can be a bit challenging to identify or tell the difference between. And actually some of the females in the next slide I'll show you can be challenging to tell apart too. But we'll spend some time going through some ways to help tease out which species the orange birds might be. So here's a group of photos of the female hummingbirds that we can see in California. As you can see, they all look pretty similar to each other. Though I don't know if you can tell, but the three species on the top all have like an orange cast to them. Like if you look along their sides or on the upper part of their tail feathers closest to their bodies, you'll see like an orange cast on some of them. So that can be helpful in determining whether it's an orange bird or a green bird. And so the green birds are down below. And actually the black-chinned hummingbird female, I don't know why it looks like it has a little bit of an orange cast. That might be, actually I think it is a younger bird. So the young birds can be tricky too. But yeah, we'll go through some ID tips as we move forward. And here's just an example of a few hummingbird guides that are helpful for hummingbird ID in the field. The Peterson Field Guide, Hummingbirds of North America, is really helpful. Also, there's the Howl Guide, the Hummingbirds of North America, is really nice too. And I like the pamphlets as well. I'll keep those with me when I'm banding, usually just for a quick ID. All right, so we'll get into some of the ID tips here. And actually, I'm going to try and keep an eye on the time because I don't, oh, we actually are 6:40. Well, I'll try and go through these pretty quickly, and I will be sending out this slide deck so that you guys can look at it in more detail. So first things first, can you tell whether it's a male or a female? So the obviously male birds are like the one on the left, that's a male and a hummingbird, will have just a full, it's called a gorget. Just that chin area is just covered in those bright metallic feathers. The bird on the right, it's more of a here and there kind of thing with the iridescent feathers. It's not a full gorget, it's more of a spotty gorget. So that bird could either be a female bird or it could be a young male bird. So female plumage birds mean it could be an adult or after hatch year female. And it could also be a young hatch year female in juvenile plumage. It could also be a young male in juvenile plumage. They all look very similar. So, you know, a lot of this I got from my banding training, but I thought it was really helpful. I've noticed, I think my ID skills have improved just seeing birds around the yard and in the wild, just for looking for certain cues. I'm still with some species and not 100% certain, but at least I feel like I can narrow it down to something that's most likely. So second thing second, female type plumage. You want to look for the green colored birds or orange colored birds. So we already talked a little bit about where to look for the orange feathers. Yeah, you want to look along the flank, and then also near the body, those tail feathers can sometimes have an orange cast. And then you probably will not be able to see this unless you have a bird in the hand. But sometimes you do get the opportunity to have a bird in the hand, say if you have a bird that hits your window or if it's a cat-caught bird. But if you do get a bird in the hand, if you have a minute and you have a magnifying glass handy, it is interesting to try and take a look at this feature. So young hummingbirds will have what we call bill corrugations. They're really obvious if you have a magnifying glass and good lighting on the youngest birds, like that are just out of the nest. And they look like these grooves, and they're just they're angled a little bit. They're not up and down, but yeah, they're kind of like dashes. And then as the hummingbirds age over the course of the year, the corrugations, they'll start to shrink down towards the middle. So like the end of the bill and the part of the bill that's closest to the head, it'll start to get smooth, but the center will still retain those corrugations until the end of the year, and then they completely disappear. But that is super helpful for being able to tell the age of the bird. And here's some photos. The photo on the left shows the corrugations that are all along the length of the bill. And then on the right-hand side, you see the smooth, hardened bill that's of an adult bird. And here's another tip to look for. Buffy feathers, or like the tips of the feathers on the back and the head can have this buffy hue in young birds. And as the birds age, the tips of the feathers, they wear down. And so the buffy tips go away over time. And then once I get that adult molt in the fall, then the buffy tips go away completely. But this can be handy. And I usually try and keep an eye out like around this time of year when a lot of the hummingbirds are leaving their nests, because then it's really obvious You can see the buffy coloring. All right, and here we're getting into how to determine different species from each other. So for the green birds, sometimes it can be helpful, like if you see a bird perched. It's really hard if a bird is in flight, but if a hummingbird is perched with their wings outstretched, sometimes you can see the outermost wing or the outermost feather. It's called P10 or the 10th primary, which is the outermost wing feather. But so Anna's and Costa's hummingbirds have a nice like fairly straight feather with a slight curve on the end, whereas black chin hummingbirds, that's another green bird, and they have a really strong curve at the end and almost looks club shaped or squared off at the end. And for Anna's, so Anna's are considered to be a green bird. They don't have any rufous coloring on the tail, and they've got a rose or magenta colored gorget if present. Sometimes it can be hard to see any iridescent feathers on females, but it seems like as the females get older, they get more iridescent feathers. And then in the tail feathers, again, this is easier to see when the bird is perched. And sometimes while a bird is feeding, they might spread out their tail feathers into a nice fan. So sometimes you can see this, but yeah, most of the time you can't. But for telling young birds apart, young Annas apart, you can take a look at the outermost tail feather. The top ones, so number 3, 4, and 8, you'll see there's quite a bit of white on the tip. Whereas in the middle there, the half-shear male in photos 1 and 2, they actually have more black. And if you take a look, it looks like there's black going up the rachis, which is that center vein of the feather going. And so the black goes up the rachis towards the tip of the feather. And it looks like the black is kind of bleeding into the white. So that's a tip for looking for males in those young birds. And then an adult male has an all black tail. So those are pretty easy to tell apart. Plus they usually have that bright gorget anyways. So those are pretty easy. All right, so black chin hummingbird, another green hummingbird. They're smaller than Anna's hummingbirds. And the males, they almost look like they have an executioner cap on, because if the light isn't hitting them just right, it's hard to see that that gorget is purple. So a lot of times it looks black, and the gorget is like straight across. Whereas in a Costa's hummingbird, they have the gorget has like 2 lines going down the sides, more of like a helmet. And the female black chin hummingbird I don't see the iridescent feathers on black chin hummingbirds ever. Whereas in another species, you will see like the iridescent feathers here and there, like on the chin. But I feel like with the black chin hummingbirds, they've got like this smooth, like smoky look to their chin. So that's pretty interesting. And also, and it's easier to see in the female here on the right, it looks like they have a slightly curved bill. It's definitely more curved than it is on the Anna's hummingbirds. And then again, I wanted to show the comparison between the 2 outermost wing feathers. Just a black chin has that really curved, like club-shaped feather. All right, and then for the tail feathers on black chins, they have a pretty sharp point, which is interesting. So if they happen to spread their tail, you can look for whether it's pointed or more rounded. And then for male versus female, if you happen to see from counting out from the outermost feather in, that 3rd feather in from the outermost feather, if it's a male, it's going to have just a tiny little bit of white at the tip. It's really small. Whereas the females, if you look at that photo on the right, they'll have much more white. So that's a good. And then if you happen to have a bird in the hand and calipers with you, you can always measure the area of that white tip if you really want to know for sure. So yeah, and then also for black-chinned hummingbirds, you can take a look at the outermost tail feather, which again, so the hatchier female is more rounded, whereas the hatchier male is much more pointed. All right, so Allen's and Rufus, these guys are tough. They look almost identical, but they're so beautiful. So you can often determine the species by looking at the tail feathers. Again, you would need a spread tail to be able to look for these characteristics. But yeah, so when it talks about R2 here, that means so R1 is the two feathers in the very center of the tail, and the R2 is the next tail feather over from the center. So the center ones are called number 1, and then next to that is number 2. So on the left photo, that you can notice that R2 is pretty like straight on the margin, whereas the feather on the right photo, there's a distinctive notch in it. It looks like someone took their scissors and cut it out, actually. So the notch in the tail is actually a characteristic of Rufus hummingbirds, and the smooth margin on the tail feathers is a characteristic of Allen's hummingbirds. This is what I usually use to try and determine Allen's versus Rufus. Allen's hummingbirds shown at the top, they are mostly green on the back. It's usually 95 to 100% green, whereas Rufus have a lot more orange on them. So as you see on the bottom right, that's a male Rufus, and he's pretty darn close to just solid orange. And the bird on the left, that's probably a female Rufus. They have more green and less orange, but as you see, especially in the tail area, you'll see there's a lot more orange in there than on the Allen's up above. But yeah, again, those can be kind of challenging to tell apart. And the females of the species can be really difficult because they look so similar. So the way to tell apart for sex identification, you can look at the innermost tail feathers. So that's number 1 tail feathers right dead in the center. If you've got a really orange feather on the bird, that's going to be a male. And if it's pretty much a green feather with a little bit of orange at the base, that's going to be a female. And then on the left-hand side, so these are hatchier birds. The Allen's is going to have a much thinner outermost tail feather than a Rufus. The Rufus, it's hard to tell apart. I usually rely on my calipers to be able to measure and tell the difference for certain, because there is a tiny bit of overlap in the width. But sometimes if a male is like stretching his tail feathers out, if the outermost feather looks really narrow, and also this is another tip I use, Allen's tend to be more on the coast in California, and Rufus tend to be more inland. So I also take that into account as well when I'm trying to determine what species I'm looking at. And so, yeah, and also, so for females, they can have up to 70% Rufus, and then if there is black, it's only at the tip of that middle feather on the tail, just a little bit, or it can be completely absent. Whereas on the males, it's much more orange. And there's a lot more black on the end of that tail feather. And then here's a handy tool that I actually refer to this a lot when I'm banding. I'll just take a look at this and then take a look at the tail feathers to see what I've got. But yeah, let me take a look at the time really quick. You know, I might jump ahead because this goes on for a bit longer. And it really, you need the bird in hand for the most part to be able to take a look at this. But yeah, I'll definitely email these slides out to you guys. So yeah, it's something that was interesting, I thought, is for Allen's. I love banding birds on the coast because the Allen's hummingbirds have the coolest courtship display. Well, I think you're probably all familiar with that Allen's hummingbird display too, but Allen's, they, well, I don't know if you guys are aware, but hummingbirds, when they're doing their courtship displays, they can make sounds with their feathers. The sounds can be made with their tail feathers and with their flight feathers, the wing feathers. So it's super cool. So there's two types of courtship displays that Allen's males will show. So usually the female, she'll just be like perched somewhere, and then a male will want to come along and impress her. And so they'll do this shuttling, it's called shuttling display, where they'll go back and forth in front of the female. But the one I really think is cool is they'll do this steep dive. They'll just go way down, and then they'll start this like pendulum kind of swing, which is they just go back and forth swing, and they make a really cool sound with their feathers. It's like a snapping sound kind of each time they hit the end of the pendulum. And I just think it's so cool. Like the more time I spend with hummingbird, like the more like I'll listen for their courtship displays, because now I can tell them apart based on just the sound of their courtship display. The Anna's hummingbirds, I think probably most people are familiar with that like kind of whistling sound they make as they go way up high and then they drop down and they make that J shape. Anyways, I think it's so cool. And both of these orange species, they're listed as species of conservation concern with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. So they're actually in steep decline. So we are keeping an eye on those species to see what we can do to keep them from declining further. Oh, and also I did mention for Allen's, they tend to hang out on the coast, whereas Rufus tend to hang out inland a bit more. And calliope hummingbirds. Oh, it looks like we've got something in the chat. I'm sorry. Would somebody mind reading that out to me? I'm not sure I'll be able to see it.
Oh yeah, absolutely. So you said maybe you folks are familiar with the courtship ritual, and I was just kind of hoping that you'd tell us.
Oh yeah, totally. Hopefully I covered that okay.
Yeah, totally. That was great.
Cool, thanks. So yeah, calliope hummingbirds, they're really small. Yeah, and they're super cool. And I feel like they're pretty easy to identify. Well, the males are pretty easy to tell apart from other species because they have that like stripy pink look to their gorget. I've never seen that on another hummingbird. And actually when they're showing off to a female, they'll actually flip those magenta feathers outward, so they're almost like facing up towards the sky. They actually look kind of goofy in my opinion when they do that, but it must be really exciting for the female. But you can see in the photo of the female on the right, she has a bit of that orange hue to her, the feathers on her flank. So yeah, hood calliopes are considered one of the orange species. And then here's some more photos showing just the orangey cast to some of their feathers. And also it's really interesting, their tail, their tail is pretty blunt and like squared off, whereas other species are more rounded. And it's got that little point in the central tail feathers, which is another good indicator that it's a calliope. And it's kind of a stubby tail too, compared to other species. It's a little bit on the short end. And then here, the one on the left is a female, and the one on the right is a male. But again, you can tell it's like that's flat, kind of squared off look to the tail. And then here's an all male tail for the calliope hummingbird. So that's an adult. And yeah, very black. And then I thought I would talk a bit at the end about conservation. I don't know if any of you are aware, but next Saturday is International Migratory Bird Day. And it's super cool. It's a good chance to celebrate birds and get out and go do something fun. A lot of places are having special activities or bird conservation programs to celebrate the day. And I don't know if any of you are familiar, but if you go on, it's called Environment for the Americas. They have, I think they try and organize the International Migratory Bird Day, and they have all these freebies on there. So like if you want to like set up your own event or table or something, you've got you can get free handouts, and they have a free PowerPoint on there if you want to give a presentation. And they change it up every year. So they have like a new theme each year. This year's theme is on water conservation and the importance of water for birds. So yeah, if you guys are interested and have time, I recommend checking out that website. And so along those lines, I wanted to mention, I think this has been all over the news for the last few years, but I know there's still a lot of people who haven't heard. But there was a paper published in the journal Science in 2019, talking about the decline of birds across North America. Essentially, now it's become a tagline where people just talk about the loss of 3 billion birds. So the paper, just in summary, it says that nearly 3 billion birds have gone missing since 1970. And this paper, it's the first ever comprehensive assessment of population changes in the US and Canada. And it shows across the board declines that scientists are calling staggering. Sorry. It's just really, really sad. I was thinking of showing a video, but it made me cry, so I decided against it. Maybe I can email the link to you guys if you want to watch it on your own. But yeah, for forest birds, they've been hit really hard. They've lost an estimated 1 billion birds over the last 30 years. And grassland birds have also declined by half, or another 720 million birds. And shorebirds have also been hit really hard too. But so interestingly, with hummingbirds, another paper was recently published, and this is a 2021 paper that came out, but it shows some species of hummingbirds are actually doing really well, and their populations are increasing. So Anna's and Costa's hummingbirds are doing well, and also ruby-throated hummingbirds on the East Coast and black-chinned hummingbirds are most likely doing well also, but the orange birds are not doing as well. As you can see, the rufous is actually declined quite a bit, and Allen's is also declining, along with calliope and broad-tailed hummingbirds. But I wanted to talk a little bit. I know we're getting close. Does anyone need a break before we go into some of the fun things we can do for hummingbirds? And I'm guessing people probably need a bit of a break. It's been about an hour. And I think I'll stop my slideshow too.